Hello all, welcome to the very first episode of Geo-Files for this year. I know I promised you guys a plate tectonics video, and I am working on it. I swear, very slowly it's coming about. But something else has come up that I think needs to be addressed here. We're going to have a little fun with this, but I'm also going to show you some basic geologic principles and how they can be applied to fight everyday sort of weird and bizarre claims. And some of you can probably see what's on the board behind me here. Well, these books too, which of course will be linked below if you want to purchase them. But we are going to talk about the Jugurtha Tableland. And I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, and to avoid butchering it again, I am going to refer to it from this point on as the mesa. For those of you who don't know what a mesa is, this is the definition, but we need to keep this going, so I'm going to assume that you do. Why am I going to talk about this mesa? Well, because it has led to a certain group of people trying to claim that it's basically a tree stump, and other than the fact that, I don't know, somebody with a really big chainsaw would have had to have cut this thing down, there's other reasons why it is not a tree stump. And this appears on the internet from time to time. And if you don't know what you're looking at, I can see how you might make that assumption, especially if you don't understand like the basic biology of trees and realizing that a tree literally 30 kilometers high can't supply itself with the necessary nutrients. It wouldn't be able to get water up to its branches, plus all the other problems. But we're going to attack this from a geologic standpoint because there is an explanation for why this mesa looks the way that it does. I'm going to show you pictures of the mesa. They are actual pictures. They can be easily found online. And I myself have never been there, but I can use remote techniques to come up with a hypothesis that someone else can test in the field in the future if they would like to. Now, where is this mesa? It's in Tunisia, Africa, which it's about right here. Yeah, the pin's way bigger than that. It's not that big, but I suppose the tree stump that it supposedly would have been a tree about that tall, reaching far into space. But that aside, it's usually put forth by people who not only think the Earth is 6,000 years old, but tend to think it's flat. Not a surprise there. Now, when you look at a geologic map of the area, Tunisia does not have any large-scale geologic maps, meaning there's no detailed maps of this mesa made with topographic lines and the geology. The best I can do from the background information I can gather, and I could be wrong, is that this thing is Cretaceous to Paleogene in age, most likely Eocene, but that could be wrong. There is a map that I use that has some good detail, and it looks like there's another structure to the north that's mesa-like, but not really. That makes me think that this may actually be Eocene according to the map that I am looking at. But like I said, take it with a grain of salt because I don't know for sure. What I do know about this mesa is that it's made of carbonate rock, most likely limestone. And I seem to remember reading somewhere that it had fossils in it, marine fossils, which would right away kill the whole tree stump thing. But I can't find where I saw that, and I don't remember. But we don't need that. We can use other principles here to determine that this thing is not a tree stump from a geologic standpoint. Now, you can go to Google Earth and just type in the name of the mesa, and it comes right up. It'll take you right there. But you also have to take Google Earth with a grain of salt. Although you can see the top really well, there's no road views you can go to like you can in populated areas in North America and Europe. So you can't get a street view. But we do have pictures of people walking along the sides taking photos, and that's going to help us. And the elevations on Google Earth have to be taken with a grain of salt too, because they are taken from a satellite that I believe was launched in the year 2000. And areas with a lot of drastic topography, if you looked at a topographic map, the lines would be really close together. It doesn't pick those out very well. So you can't use that as a guide either, but there's data telling you how tall this thing is anyway from the surrounding relatively flat area. And here you're not that far from the border of Algeria, and Tunisia is a democracy, and it is friendly to the United States and North Americans and Europeans. So, you know, maybe we'll visit it someday. I don't know, but probably not. So we're going to stick with remote techniques now, although in geology, nothing beats being out in the field and having that rock in your hand to determine what's going on and taking strike and dip and things like that. But alas, I can't do that, so we're going to do it this way. But before we get into the mesa, I need to talk about tree stumps a little bit for these purposes. This could be a cross section or looking at a tree stump where somebody has cut down the tree. Imagine the tree going up and higher, and there's rings in there. And the mesa kind of looks like this. It's not complete, it's missing a good chunk, but if you don't know anything about geology and you live in a fantasy world, I can see how you might think it's a tree stump. But anyway, rings in a tree. As a tree grows, it leaves rings behind. During periods of growth, it'll grow faster, then it'll stop making a ring, then it'll grow, etc., usually on an annual basis, so we can count these things and get a rough age of the actual tree. Everybody knows this. If the mesa were a tree stump, how would we expect these rings to propagate through the stump? Well, obviously, they would propagate down into the stump. You know, in cylindrical shape, cylinders wrapped within cylinders wrapped within cylinders, essentially. It's not going to be exactly like that, but you get the point. These circles are going to extend down. They aren't going to be this way. Okay, and I will show you a physical model. I can't believe it worked, but that's how that would look if we were to take this supposed tree stump, cut it into cross section here. The rings would look vertical to us. And anyone who's actually seen a petrified tree like we have, the trees being preserved extremely well with their structures intact, you get real good ones like that, but the vast majority aren't like that. Let alone are they going to be like this unless they have fallen, once they've been petrified, turned into rock, and then they fracture. But this thing is sticking out of the ground like this. You almost will never see a petrified tree with a stump still in the ground with a nice smooth top to it. So that should send up red flags right there. Now, before I get into these views, I want to talk a little bit about the human history. Not too much. There's great videos online where you can actually go with people who have visited the mesa and take a tour. And human beings, being human beings, like to focus on things human beings do and not so much the natural world, especially if they don't think much is going on. So there are some good videos on tours of this plateau that show you what humans have done to it. And in a nutshell, it's been occupied from time to time. People have dug out reservoirs. People have even dug out caves in there. And the caves are a good clue as well. So we can use what people have done to try to figure out what's going on. And the caves are important because it's when you dig out caves, you want to dig in something that's going to be easy, which the mesa is. It's a carbonate rock, a limestone. I think some places it could even be marly. So it's not really well indurated, but it's more indurated than the surrounding ground is. So it tends to just be a remnant. And there's a lot of these little erosional remnants in the area. This one's just the oddest looking to some people. And the fact that there are caves with very level roofs inside and pillars carved around to keep that roof up tells you something. It tells you that they're digging out beds, keeping flat beds above and flat beds below them in order to make it easier on themselves. They didn't know about geology then. They just knew how to easily dig into the rock. And that tells you that there's bedding here. But there's another thing that tells you there's bedding here. And this is basically what it looks like from a top view, just my quick and dirty. Here's the specs on the rough size of this thing if you would want to know exactly. It's big, but it's not absolutely huge. And as you can see, you might be thinking from looking at Google Images that this thing doesn't really look like a tree stump, but we'll assume the rest has been eroded, which would make their estimate of however tall they think this thing is even bigger and even less likely. But you look at it and you see the rings on top. Now remember when I said digging caves following bedding is really easy because it leaves you a nice flat top, roof, and floor. If the bedding was like this, meaning that when this was deposited in a sea, regardless of the age, it would have been deposited on a relatively level surface, so the beds would essentially be flat, especially on something this small of a scale. And that means the beds are stacked up on top of one another, following basic geologic principles that every geology student knows their very first year. So if I was to dig a cave into something like this, if these rings went into the ground, think about it. I'm going to start digging, I'm going to dig, and I'm going to have this rounded top and this rounded floor, and I'm going to come to a flat wall as I come to the edge of one of those rings. Well, that doesn't happen. What happens is they were able to carve, I forget exactly where they are, lots of caves into this thing as if it was flat bedding or relatively close to it. And you look at the images and you can tell that, maybe this thing is pretty flat lying. But from a geologic standpoint, it can actually be several things that we have to rule out. Now, even though we look at the pictures of the mesa that people have taken from the ground, we can clearly see lines going like this, the bedding. That still doesn't give us a really big clue other than the fact that these lines are probably intersecting these lines here. In geology, you have to have the ability to think three-dimensionally. If you can't do that, you will never pass your courses. Structural geology is all about 3D thinking. Now we can see that we have level beds, and they might dip slightly. In the model I'm going to show you, it doesn't really matter if they dip by a few degrees or not. It's irrelevant. It's not going to affect the outcome that much, but they appear relatively flat. So we have three options. This thing could be a dome, a basin, or just an odd erosional feature. How do we rule that out? Well, I'm going to show you later when I show you my physical model. But you look at the Google Earth images of this thing, you can see this valley here, kind of a little erosional remnant off to the side here. And you can see how the line kind of follows the valley. That's key, all right? Now, that made me think, and I started like, wow, you know what? I can think of these as topo lines. And anyone who's seen a topographic map, if you have, a round hill, your topo lines are going to look like this. That doesn't mean your hill's a tree stump. And if you put that into cross section, your topo lines don't exist in reality, but they're like this. Kind of like how this is. And when I started thinking about topography, I started thinking about a basic geologic principle that I think about when I'm mapping, but when I'm doing stuff like this, I don't think about very much. And that's called the rule of V's. And it's a basic concept in structural geology and mapping. Basically what it says, and I'm going to show you a diagram here, is that your strata, your bed that was relatively flat when it was deposited, if it's been subjected to some sort of deformation like tilted or part of an anticline or syncline, and a dome is just a closed off anticline and a basin is a closed off syncline, that your strata on your map, if you're drawing it on a topo map as your base, is going to form a set of strict V's. It's going to follow the rule of V's, and in a vertical bed there's going to be no V. We see V's on the top of this. So if these were rings extending into there, we wouldn't see what we see, all right? But the V pattern that we do see is very conducive with almost level, flat-lying beds. if it were on a dome, even a very subtle dome, RVs would look completely different than what they do here. So we could rule out dome. Now, our next one, basin. We can also rule out in a very similar way. However, if these beds are very shallowly dipping towards the center, like maybe a couple of degrees, it might be hard to see. Even applying the rule of these, it could be very difficult to see if this is a basin. But even if it is a basin, the beds are very shallowly dipping, so they can be modeled relatively flat and level. We're talking less than a couple degrees dip, probably less than one. So we can kind of rule out a basin unless something funky happens within this that no one is aware of, because like I said, there haven't been any detailed mapping efforts. So basically we are left with erosional feature. Well, Steve, how can I get an erosional feature with flat-lying beds and have erosion occur and get something that gives me a ring structure? I'm glad you asked. And this is where we get into my physical model. And when I was making this, I was hoping it would work. I was just like, this better work, because I know people who look at computer generated models and they just immediately dismiss them because they're computer generated, even though all the data is legit. So I figured if I could build a physical model, I can't listen to that kind of ridiculousness. Well, what I did was I bought some little flat balsa woods, 4 sets, and in order to see the bedding, I had to dye half of them, so I dyed them with this blue dye. The blue dye, I couldn't keep the wood in there that long, because if I did, I was worried that it would warp the wood as it dried. You know, it's soaking up water. So I did 3 treatments, only at a minute or 2 a piece, and then I set them aside to dry. Now when they dried, a couple did warp, but just a tiny bit, and I was hoping the dye went all the way through, but I scratched one up a little. It did not. But as it turns out, it's not gonna matter. This still worked. I can't believe it. So after that, what I did was I took the pieces of wood and glued them one on top of another, alternating light and dark. We'll say white and blue in this case, in order to represent clear bedding so it would show up on camera. It's a model for demonstration purposes. It's not to scale, it's to illustrate my point. Does the Mesa have alternating white and blue beds? Of course it doesn't, and it's irrelevant. Like I said, this is not a 2-scale duplication. So just gonna nip that one in the bud real quick. So after I glued everything together, I took it to my sander, took it outside, put it in a vice grip, and just started sanding with my electric sander. And I'm like, this isn't gonna work, this isn't gonna work. And as I kept doing it, it started to work. And even though the dye did not go all the way through, it doesn't matter. This is the end product right here. This would be as if you were in the sky looking down. This is the top. And as you can see, there's rings. You can even see some brown rings in there from the pieces of wood. See, the wood itself, each individual piece was glued together from 3 thinner pieces. But if I turn it sideways, so this, you're looking at this here, all right? Obviously, it's not the right shape. There would be erosion, stuff like that. Like I said, it's an illustrated point. So what's it look like this way? Like that. Exactly like you would expect if this were made of level, horizontal beds stacked on top of each other, and we had an erosion surface on top making a ring type shape. Granted, this model is a little bit topographically exaggerated, but like I said, it's a model, not a replica. And you can see here, I have a notch in there, and I want you to look at that notch. Kind of looks like another series of notches, doesn't it? I did that to show you the rule of V's. And as you can see, this blue line forms a V on this level bed towards the upstream direction. And it does the same thing from what I can tell from my remote viewing of the mesa. That's what makes me think these beds are pretty level and flat throughout the structure and not a basin type situation. So this is how you can get a structure, a mesa, to look like it has rings on top with absolutely flat bedding planes. As you can see, there's no magic involved here. There's no tree stump needed to explain this at all. All you need is a basic understanding of the basic laws of stratigraphy and have a very loose understanding of structural geology, and you could have figured this out by yourself. And some map reading experience would also help you as well. My hypothesis is that the mesa is nothing more than an odd erosional feature, some sort of illusion created by the way this thing is eroded, both physically and chemically over time. Obviously, we have signs of water erosion because we have that little valley there, but we also have signs of mechanical weathering, like on the fringes and sides and things like that. So as a professional geologist, this is my interpretation. Now, if someone would like to go out there or has access to this mesa and they have a Brunton transit or compass, whatever you want to call it, and can take strikes and dips of these beds and make a decent, good map, then we could settle this for sure. But right now, it's a hypothesis based on available existing data and techniques, and not just something I pulled out of my back end as an explanation for something I don't understand. So anyway, I think that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I hope you learned something.